One quiet autumn afternoon, a man drove across the city to surprise his wife at the office where she was the chief executive, carrying her favorite coffee in one hand and a sandwich he had made for her by hand in the other. At the security desk in the gleaming marble lobby, he told the guard, politely, that he was the husband of the CEO. And the guard laughed. Not a small, polite laugh, but a genuine baffled laugh that echoed off the cold stone walls. "Sir," the guard said, "I see her husband every single day. In fact, there he is right now walking out the front doors." And a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit strode past. A man this husband had never shared a single meal with. A man the entire building knew, without a flicker of doubt, as the husband of the woman he had been married to for 28 years. In that one moment in that cold and shining lobby, a quarter-century of a man's life quietly came apart at the seams. But the gentle, steady, easily overlooked man standing frozen there was an accountant. And the very thing his wife had decided to throw him away for being careful and patient and unremarkable, was about to become the thing that brought her entire secret life crashing down around her. Before I begin, let me ask you to do one small thing for me. Tell me, down in the comments, the name of the city you are listening from tonight, because it always amazes me to see how far these stories travel across the world. And if you have ever been the steady, quiet one, the one somebody decided was not exciting enough, not ambitious enough, not enough, then stay with me right to the very end, because the moment this quiet man stops being underestimated is a moment you are going to want to see. Now let me tell you the story. But first, let me show you what I gathered from my garden this morning. The dew was still heavy on everything when I went out to the back fence, where my chayote vine has been climbing all season, and I began to harvest the susu, the pale green gourds hanging quietly among the broad leaves. If you have never grown chayote, let me tell you about it because it is one of the most underestimated things that ever grew in a garden. It is not a fruit that calls attention to itself. It is a plain, pale green, a little wrinkled with a humble knobby shape, and it has no perfume to speak of and no flashy color. Set it beside a glossy red apple or a golden mango at the market, and the eye will always drift to the showier fruit, and the chayote will sit there, quiet and ignored, looking to the careless shopper, like the most boring thing on the whole table. But oh, how wrong that careless shopper would be. Because the chayote is one of the most patient and generous things a garden can give you. Its vine climbs quietly, steadily, season after season, never demanding attention, and it sends its roots down deep, deeper and stronger than you would ever guess from the modest leaves on top. It does not bloom in a burst of glory and then wither in a week, the way the flashy things so often do. It endures. It bears and goes on bearing, long after the showy plants have given up. And on your plate, that plain pale gourd that nobody looked at twice turns out to be the one that quietly nourishes you. Day after day, steady and dependable and good. The people who pass it by for something more exciting never learn what they have missed. And here is the part that always makes me smile, my friends. The one who throws away the humble, steady chayote, reaching instead for the bright and glittering fruit, so very often discovers, only a few days later, that the glittering fruit has gone soft and brown and rotten in their hand, while the chayote they tossed aside would have fed them faithfully all winter long. I thought about my susu this morning, as I eased each one from the vine and laid it gently in my basket, because the story I want to tell you is about a man exactly like that humble green gourd. His wife looked at him and saw only the plain, quiet surface. She decided he was boring. Unexciting. Not enough. So she set him aside and reached for something that glittered. She never understood the deep, strong roots beneath his quiet ways, or how faithfully he had nourished her life for all those years. And she had no idea at all how quickly the glittering thing she reached for would rot in her hands, while the steady man she discarded simply went on enduring, deep-rooted and unbroken, exactly as he always had. So let me tell you about the day a careless woman threw away her chayote, and learned far too late what she had thrown away. His name was Leo Avery, and he was 56 years old, and until one particular Thursday in October, he believed with his whole heart that he knew his wife better than anyone in the world. Leo was an accountant, and had been one his entire adult life. He ran a small, quiet practice of his own, the kind where he knew his clients by name and remembered their children's birthdays, where he untangled people's taxes and steadied their small businesses, and gave them honest counsel without ever charging for the extra hour. It was not a glamorous profession, and Leo was not a glamorous man. He was the sort of person who found deep contentment in simple things: a good book on a quiet evening, a meal cooked at home, a long walk on a Sunday. He was gentle and he was loyal and he was steady as the seasons. And for 28 years, he had built his entire life around a woman named Meredith. Meredith Avery was, by any outward measure, the more impressive of the two. She was the chief executive officer of Helix Dynamics, a fast-rising technology company in the heart of the city, and she wore her success the way some women wear fine jewelry, easily and as though she had been born to it. She put in 12 and 14-hour days. She flew to conferences and sat on panels and handled board meetings and client emergencies with a cool, commanding confidence that Leo had always quietly admired from a distance. She earned 3 times what he did, and Leo had never once resented it. He was proud of her. He told everyone who would listen how proud he was. When she came home exhausted at 9 or 10 at night, he had her dinner waiting, warm and ready, and he listened to the stories of her day, and he never complained about the many, many evenings he had eaten alone. They had met nearly 30 years before, at a mutual friends' gathering, when Meredith was a sharp, ambitious young woman just beginning to climb, and Leo was a steady young accountant who made her laugh. She had told him once in the early years that he was the calmest harbor she had ever known, that being with him felt like coming home after a long storm. He had held on to those words for decades, like a smooth stone he kept in his pocket. They had bought a red brick house together when she made her first big promotion, and they had planted a garden, and they had built what Leo believed, with every fiber of his being, was a good and solid marriage. He thought he knew her. He thought he knew everything. But somewhere along the way, slowly, so slowly that Leo never saw it happening, Meredith had begun to change, and to look at her quiet harbor of a husband with different eyes. Where he saw contentment, she had come to see stagnation. Where he saw loyalty, she had come to see a lack of ambition. Where he saw a comfortable, peaceful life lovingly built, she had begun, in some private corner of her heart, to see a cage. And Leo, who trusted her completely, who had never in his life been given a reason not to, noticed none of it. He went on making her dinners and listening to her stories and telling everyone how proud he was, never dreaming that the woman he was building his whole world around had already, quietly, begun to dismantle hers. It started, as the worst things so often do, with the smallest and most innocent of intentions. Meredith had been working later than ever, pulling those grueling 12 and 14-hour days, and Leo had been eating alone too many nights in a row, reading her texts about board meetings and client crises across the empty kitchen table. That particular Thursday morning, she had rushed out the door without even pausing for her usual coffee, and Leo, watching her go, had thought to himself that a small surprise might brighten her long day. So that afternoon, he made her favorite sandwich, the way she liked it, and he picked up the exact latte she always ordered, and he drove downtown to the gleaming office tower of Helix Dynamics to surprise the wife he adored. He had only been to her office a handful of times in all their years together. Meredith had always said it was easier to keep work and home separate, and Leo, who respected boundaries the way he respected everything else, had never questioned it. Perhaps he would think later he had respected too many boundaries. The lobby was all marble and chrome and glass, the kind of intimidating corporate cathedral that made him grateful for his own small warm office across town. A security guard sat behind an imposing desk, a kind-faced older man whose nameplate read Earl. Leo approached with a friendly smile, holding up his paper bag. "Good afternoon," he said. "I'm here to see Meredith Avery." "I'm her husband, Leo." Earl looked up, and his expression shifted from professional politeness into something Leo could not quite read, a kind of puzzled tilt of the head, as though the guard were trying to solve a riddle. "You said you're Mrs. Avery's husband," Earl repeated slowly. "Yes, that's right," Leo said, suddenly feeling oddly foolish standing there with his brown paper bag. "I brought her some lunch." And then Earl did the thing that froze the blood in Leo's veins. He laughed. Not unkindly, not mockingly, but with genuine bewildered confusion, a laugh that rang out across the marble lobby. "Sir, I'm sorry," Earl said, "but I see Mrs. Avery's husband every single day. He just stepped out about 10 minutes ago." He gestured toward the elevators with the easy certainty of a man stating an obvious fact. In fact, there he is right now, coming back in. Leo turned, following the guard's gaze, and watched a tall man in an expensive charcoal suit stride confidently through the lobby. He was younger than Leo, perhaps in his mid-40s, with dark hair styled to perfection and shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the effortless authority of a man who was certain he belonged exactly where he was. The man nodded to the guard with familiar ease. "Afternoon, Earl," he said. "Meredith asked me to grab some files from the car." "No problem, Mr. Voss," the guard replied warmly. "She's up in her office." Adrian Voss. Leo knew that name. He knew it the way you know the name of a distant character in someone else's long-running story. Adrian Voss was Meredith's vice president, the one who had joined the company 3 years earlier, the one she mentioned now and then over dinner, always in passing, always in the most professional of terms. Adrian this, Adrian that. Always business. Always nothing. Leo's hands had gone numb around the coffee cup. The brown bag crinkled as his grip tightened without his meaning it to. Every instinct in him screamed to speak, to correct this enormous, impossible misunderstanding, to demand to know what on earth was happening. But his voice had abandoned him entirely. Earl was looking back and forth between the two men now, genuine confusion creasing his kind face. "I'm sorry, sir," the guard said gently, "but are you sure you're Mrs. Avery's husband? Because Mr. Voss here, he's the one who's married to her." Married to her. Present tense. Not separated, not a misunderstanding, not a joke, but a plain, settled, matter-of-fact statement that shattered Leo's entire reality where he stood. And Adrian Voss, hearing his name, paused mid-stride and turned, his attention drawn to the strange little scene at the security desk. His eyes met Leo's. And in that instant, Leo saw something flicker across the younger man's polished face. Not surprise. Not confusion. Recognition. Adrian Voss knew exactly who Leo was. "Is there a problem here?" Adrian asked, his voice smooth and controlled, the voice of a man long accustomed to managing difficult situations. And in that moment, something cold and steady and unexpected rose up inside Leo Avery, something born of 28 years of quietly reading people across a desk, of untangling the lies that people tell on their tax returns, of knowing always when the numbers did not add up. Every instinct still screamed at him to explode, to make the scene this betrayal so richly deserved. But a deeper, older wisdom told him very clearly to wait. To watch. To play along. "Oh, you must be Adrian," Leo heard himself say, forcing his voice into something light and easy. "Meredith's mentioned you. I'm Leo, a friend of the family." The lie tasted like ash in his mouth, but it bought him something precious. It bought him time to think. "I was just dropping off some documents for her." Adrian's shoulders relaxed a fraction, though his eyes stayed watchful. "Of course," he said. "She's in meetings most of the afternoon, but I'll make sure she gets whatever you brought." Leo handed over the coffee and the sandwich, his movements stiff and mechanical. "Just tell her Leo stopped by," he said. "Of course," Adrian replied, with a perfectly professional, perfectly normal smile, as though the two of them had not just stood together at the precise center of the most surreal moment of Leo's life. And then Leo turned and walked back out through the glass doors into the sharp October air, carrying nothing now but the ruins of everything he had believed that morning to be true. He sat in his car in the visitor parking space for a long time, staring up at the gleaming tower through his windshield. 28 years of marriage. 28 years of sharing a bed and a home, of inside jokes that no one else on earth would understand, of believing completely and without question that he knew this woman down to her bones. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text from Meredith. "Running late again tonight," it read. "Don't wait up. Love you. Love you." The words that had comforted him 10,000 times now read like just one more line in what was apparently an enormous, carefully constructed lie. How long, he wondered, sitting frozen in that parking space. How long had this been going on? How many times had Adrian Voss walked through that lobby and been greeted as her husband, while Leo sat at home alone, making dinner for one, believing every word of her stories about late meetings and long business dinners? He started the car at last and drove home through streets that suddenly felt foreign, past the familiar red brick house with both their names on the mailbox in careful script, into the quiet rooms full of vacation photos and wedding pictures, and the small ceramic bowl Meredith had made in a pottery class years ago. Everything looked exactly as he had left it that morning. And yet Leo walked through his own home now like a man walking through a stage set, a beautiful and elaborate facade, wondering, with a hollow ache spreading through his chest, whether any of it had ever been real at all. The front door opened at 9:30 that night, just as it had on 1,000 ordinary evenings. Meredith's heels clicked against the hardwood. Her keys jangled as she set them on the hall table, the familiar sounds of a familiar life. "Leo, I'm home," she called, her voice carrying that tired warmth he had grown so used to over the years. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, every inch the successful executive in her tailored navy suit, her blonde hair still perfectly arranged despite the long day. "How was your day?" she asked. The question was automatic, the same one she asked every night. Leo studied her face, searching for any sign that she knew about his visit, any flicker that she understood her two worlds had collided in that marble lobby. There was nothing. Her expression was exactly what it had always been. Tired and distracted but genuinely glad to see him. "I brought you coffee today," Leo said carefully, setting his own cup down. "To your office?" Meredith paused, just for the briefest fraction of a second, in the middle of reaching for a wine glass. Something shifted behind her eyes, there and gone again so fast he might have imagined it. Then she smiled. "You did," she said. "I didn't get any coffee. I gave it to Adrian to pass along." Another pause, just as brief. "Oh, he mentioned someone stopped by. I had back-to-back meetings all afternoon. I must have missed you." She moved to the refrigerator, her back to him, and poured herself a glass of wine, and Leo watched her hands the entire time. They were perfectly steady. Not a tremor, not a hitch. Either she was telling the truth, or she was the most accomplished liar he had ever encountered in his life, and after 28 years of marriage, he was terrified to learn which one it was. "That was sweet of you," she added, "to think of me." And the rest of the evening passed in a surreal pantomime of normality. The two of them watching the news, discussing the weekend, moving through the same bedtime routine they had followed for decades, while underneath it all, a terrible new awareness pulsed in Leo's chest like a second heartbeat. That night, lying in the dark beside his sleeping wife, listening to her breathe deep and peaceful and untroubled, Leo did the thing he had always done best. He began to calculate. 3 years since Adrian Voss had joined the company. 3 years of late nights and business trips, and the name dropped so casually over dinner. Adrian this, Adrian that, always in passing, always professional, conditioning him, he understood now, conditioning him gently and patiently to accept this man's presence in her life. How many evenings had he eaten alone, believing in a client emergency that was no emergency at all? How long had he been sharing his life with a woman who was living an entirely different one whenever he could not see her? But the question that haunted him most as he stared at the ceiling was not about timelines or evidence. It was far simpler and far more devastating. Who was the woman sleeping beside him? And who had he been married to all these years? The next morning came with a cruel ordinariness. Meredith kissed his cheek before she left, the same quick peck she had given him for 20 years, wearing the perfume he had bought her 2 Christmases ago, looking exactly like the wife he loved. And then she was gone, and Leo did something he had not done once in 15 years of running his own practice. He called his assistant and said he would be working from home. He could not bear the thought of sitting across from clients discussing quarterly reports while his entire life quietly came apart. Instead, he sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee that slowly went cold, staring at Meredith's mug in the sink, the one she had drunk from that morning, and he wondered whether she had been thinking of Adrian while she did. By noon, Leo found himself doing something else he had never done, going carefully through his wife's belongings. He did not do it frantically or desperately. He did it the way he did everything, with the methodical, patient precision that had made him a good accountant for 30 years. He started in her home office, with the desk where she sometimes worked in the evenings, and at first he found nothing at all, only work papers and company letterhead and the business cards of clients he recognized from her stories. Everything exactly as it should be. And then his fingers closed around a restaurant receipt that made his stomach clench. It was from Le Marais, the French place downtown where he and Meredith had celebrated their anniversary 3 years running. It was dated 6 weeks earlier. It was for 2 people. $68.50. 2 entrees and a single bottle of wine. He remembered that night clearly, because Meredith had told him she was having dinner with a potential client, a woman from out of town who was only in the city for one evening. He had talked to her on the phone around 9:30 that night, and she had sounded relaxed and happy, describing a productive meeting, and he had been proud of her. But this was no business dinner. No appetizers ordered to impress a client. No separate drinks, just 2 meals and a bottle of wine shared across a candlelit table at the restaurant where he had once held her hand on their anniversary. His phone rang then, Meredith's name on the screen, and he answered it with a calm that surprised even himself. She was checking in, she said. She had thought he sounded off that morning. The genuine concern in her voice, the very thing that had made him fall in love with her, twisted in him now like a knife. Actually, he said, as evenly as he could manage, I was just thinking about that dinner you had with the client from Portland 6 weeks ago. How did that work out? There was a pause, so brief that most people would never have caught it, but Leo had spent 28 years learning the rhythms of her speech. She was calculating. Oh, that, she said. It didn't pan out, she went with a local firm in the end. Why do you ask? Just curious, he said. You seemed excited about it at the time. Well, she said lightly, you win some, you lose some, and he could hear her already typing, already moving on. Either she was lying about the client or she was lying about the dinner. Either way, his wife was lying to him, smoothly and without hesitation, and the knowledge settled into him cold and heavy. He spent the rest of that afternoon like a detective investigating his own life. He pulled the credit card statements he had always glanced at so casually, trusting Meredith to handle their finances since she earned so much more than he did, and now he read them line by line, the way he read a suspicious set of books. Lunch charges on days she had told him she was bringing a sandwich from home to save money. Gas station purchases in neighborhoods clear across the city, far from any route she had reason to drive. A charge at a bookstore on a Tuesday afternoon when she had supposedly been buried in back-to-back meetings, though Meredith had not bought a book for pleasure in years, always claiming she was too tired after work to read anything but trade magazines. But the most damning thing came from her laptop, which she had left open on the kitchen counter, something she had been doing more and more often over the past year. He told himself he was only closing it to save the battery. But a notification glowed in the corner of the screen. Adrian Voss had sent her a calendar invitation. And Leo, who would have been horrified by the thought of violating her privacy just 2 days before, clicked on it without hesitation because 2 days before, he had still believed his wife was faithful. The invitation was for dinner that very night, 7 o'clock at Tavola, the small Italian restaurant that had been their special occasion place for years, the very table where Leo had once gotten down on one knee and asked Meredith to marry him. The reservation was under Adrian's name. Leo's chest went tight, and he kept scrolling, and what he found there was a parallel life, meticulously scheduled and carefully hidden. Coffee with A. every Tuesday morning at 8. Dinner every other Thursday. Weekend planning, marked for that very Saturday, the same Saturday Meredith had told him she would have to work. Lunch meetings with Adrian that carried no business label at all. A weekend spa retreat 3 months earlier that she had described to Leo as a women's conference for female executives. He was not looking at the calendar of a woman having an occasional affair. He was looking at the calendar of a woman whose real life was somewhere else entirely, and whose marriage to Leo had become the inconvenient appointment to be worked around. That evening Meredith came home early, which was rare for a Thursday. And she came home dressed. She had refreshed her makeup and styled her hair, and she was wearing the black dress Leo had bought her for her birthday the year before, the one she had called too fancy for everyday wear. I managed to wrap up early for once, she said, brushing past him toward the refrigerator, her perfume trailing behind her. I thought maybe we could grab dinner out somewhere spontaneous, it's been so long. The lie was so smooth, so perfectly delivered, that a part of Leo ached to believe it, to be the grateful husband thrilled by his busy wife's sudden attention. Where were you thinking, he asked. Oh, I don't know, she said, already glancing at her phone, her thumbs moving quickly across the screen. He watched her type and wondered if she was texting Adrian, canceling, rescheduling, rearranging the pieces of her hidden life. Then she looked up, with a perfectly calibrated expression of disappointment. Actually, she said, I completely forgot I have a conference call with the Tokyo office tonight. It slipped my mind. Rain check. Of course, Leo said. What time is your call? 7:30, she said, could run till 9 or 10, you know how these international things go. And 20 minutes later she came back downstairs, having changed not into something businesslike for a phone call, but into something lovely, her makeup touched up, her hair perfect, a woman dressed for an important evening. I'll try not to be too late, she said, kissing his cheek, the same spot as that morning, except now it felt like a small betrayal pressed into his skin. Take your time, he said. And he watched her gather her purse and her keys and step out into the night, an actress leaving one performance for another. He could not help himself. At 8:30, Leo found himself driving past Tavola, telling himself he was only going to the store. And there in the restaurant parking lot sat Meredith's silver car, parked neatly beside a dark Mercedes he was now quite certain belonged to Adrian Voss. They were inside at that very moment, sharing the same kind of intimate, candlelit dinner Leo had believed belonged only to the two of them, at the very restaurant where he had proposed. The last thin thread of hope he had been holding on to quietly snapped. He drove home in a daze, and the weight of it all settled around his shoulders like a heavy sodden coat. The final piece came 3 days later in the most ordinary way imaginable. Leo was cleaning out the kitchen junk drawer, a small quarterly ritual of his, when his fingers closed around a key he did not recognize. It was brass, worn smooth at the edges, attached to a plastic fob stamped with the name Crestview Apartments, a complex he knew to be a good 30 minutes across the city. They owned their house outright and had for years. Neither of them had any earthly reason to hold a key to an apartment. That afternoon, while Meredith was at what she had called a client presentation, Leo drove to Crestview Apartments. It was a nice place, upscale but not showy, the kind of complex where a successful professional might quietly keep a second residence. He sat in his car in the visitor lot, turning the brass key over in his palm, and he wondered whether he truly wanted to know what door it opened. The answer came when a dark Mercedes pulled into a numbered space, and Adrian Voss climbed out carrying a bag of groceries and a load of dry cleaning, moving with the easy, unhurried familiarity of a man coming home, not a man visiting. When Adrian disappeared into Building C, Leo waited exactly 10 minutes, and then he followed. The key slid into the lock of apartment 214 and turned without resistance, and the door swung open onto a life Leo Avery had never known existed. It was not a hideaway. It was not a secret meeting place. It was a home, fully furnished and warmly lived in, with photographs on the mantel and books on the shelves and Meredith's favorite throw pillows, the ones he had watched her choose at a store years ago, arranged just so on a couch he had never seen. And it was the photographs that finished him. Meredith and Adrian at what looked like a company holiday party, his arm wrapped around her waist in a way that was anything but professional. The two of them on a sunlit beach Leo did not recognize, tanned and laughing, Meredith in a sundress he had never seen her wear, her left hand resting on Adrian's chest, notably bare of the wedding ring she always wore at home. Leo moved through the apartment like a ghost in his own marriage. In the bedroom, Meredith's clothes hung beside Adrian's in a shared closet. Her perfume sat on the dresser next to his cologne. 2 toothbrushes stood in the bathroom, and there was the expensive face cream Meredith had told him 6 months ago was simply too costly to buy again. But it was the kitchen that held the worst of it. On the counter sat a folder, labeled in Meredith's own neat handwriting, Future Plans. Inside, Leo found house listings, all of them in Adrian's name. Brochures for vacations to places Meredith had never once mentioned to him. A business plan for the future of Helix Dynamics, with Adrian Voss listed as Chief Executive Officer and Meredith as President. And at the very bottom of the folder, the thing that made his hands begin to shake, a consultation summary from a firm called Whitfield & Associates Family Law. According to the summary, Meredith had met with them twice over the past 4 months to discuss, in the firm's clinical phrasing, optimal divorce strategies for high-asset individuals. The document laid out her approach in cold, careful detail. She intended to file for divorce citing irreconcilable differences and emotional abandonment. The strategy involved establishing a documented pattern of Leo's alleged emotional unavailability, supported by what the lawyer called lifestyle incompatibility evidence. His preference for quiet evenings at home was to be presented as troubling social isolation. His contentment with his small accounting practice was to be reframed as a lack of ambition. His satisfaction with their comfortable, modest life was to become an inability to support his wife's professional growth. And worst of all was the timeline, because the documents made it plain that Meredith had been planning this divorce for at least 2 years, quietly building a file, carefully documenting every instance of what she described as her husband's withdrawn behavior, assembling a portrait of an inadequate man who had slowly driven his brilliant wife to seek happiness elsewhere. Leo stood in that strange kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of a second life he had never known, and something unexpected happened. The accountant in him took over. He pulled out his phone and methodically, room by room, he began to photograph everything. The shared closet, the 2 toothbrushes, the photographs on the mantel, the future plans folder, the divorce strategy page by page. And as he worked, a strange and steadying calm settled over him. For 3 days he had been tormented by the gap between what he suspected and what he could prove. Now he had answers, and the answers were devastating, but they were also clarifying. This was not an affair that had spun out of control. This was a calculated, patient 2-year project to replace one life with another, and Leo had been cast as the unwitting supporting character in the story of his own erasure. When he got home, Meredith's laptop sat open on the counter once again, and this time Leo did not hesitate. He opened her email, and there he found the rest of it. Messages between Meredith and Adrian, discussing exactly when to make the transition. Communications with her lawyer about how best to prepare Leo for the inevitable. Emails to mutual friends, gently and subtly laying the groundwork, mentioning some difficult decisions she would soon need to make about her marriage. And one message sent to her sister Caroline just 2 weeks earlier that hollowed him out completely. Leo's been so distant lately, Meredith had written. I think he's having some kind of midlife crisis, but he won't talk about it. I'm trying to be patient, but I can't sacrifice my own happiness indefinitely. Adrian thinks I should consider all my options. Reading it, Leo understood the full scope of what had been done to him. Meredith had not only been living a double life. She had been quietly, deliberately rewriting the history of their marriage, transforming every kindness he had ever shown her into evidence against him. Every quiet evening he had spent reading while she worked had become his emotional withdrawal. Every time he had encouraged her ambitions, even when it cost them time together, had become his passivity. Every patient, supportive, loving thing he had ever done was being recast as a failure, to justify an exit she had decided upon long ago. He set the laptop down gently, and he sat at his own kitchen table in the gathering dark, and for the first time, beneath the grief and the shock, he felt something else begin to harden inside him, quiet and cold and certain. The man who made Meredith's life easy was about to disappear. And in his place, the careful, patient, deeply underestimated accountant was about to go to work. Over that weekend, while Meredith was off living the parts of her life she kept hidden, Leo did something that went against every gentle, trusting instinct he had developed across 56 years. He stopped being a husband and he started being an auditor. He sat down at his kitchen table with his laptop and a legal pad and a fresh pot of coffee, and he began to do what he had always done best, which was to follow the money until it told him the truth. He pulled their bank records going back 3 years, and he laid the numbers out in clean, merciless columns, and what those columns revealed astonished him even more than the photographs in the apartment had. Meredith earned $200,000 a year as chief executive, 3 times what Leo brought home from his quiet practice. He had always assumed, without ever quite examining it, that she was the one carrying them, that his contributions were the smaller supporting share. But the numbers told a different story. Their joint household expenses had been running about $60,000 a year, more than Meredith's salary could possibly cover, and for 3 years, without ever realizing it, Leo had been the one quietly making up the difference. He earned roughly $120,000 from his practice, and he had been putting 80,000 of it straight into their joint account, keeping only 40 for his own business costs and modest needs, telling himself he was being generous, letting his hardworking wife save more of her own salary for their shared future. Except there had been no shared future. There had been Meredith's future, with Adrian, and Leo had been bankrolling it. He traced the withdrawals from their joint savings, and there it was, plain as day in his careful columns. The rent on the Crestview apartment. The intimate dinners. The weekend trips he had never been taken on. The gifts. All of it paid for, month after month, with money Leo had earned and faithfully handed over, believing it was building a life for the two of them, when in truth it had been financing his own replacement. The quiet man who had thought himself the lesser earner had been, all along, the one keeping the entire enterprise afloat, including the secret half of it that was busy erasing him. But Leo was an accountant, and an accountant knows that personal betrayal and professional misconduct often live closer together than people imagine. So over those same long days, he did something else, something that felt foreign and almost unseemly to a man of his nature. He began to investigate his own wife's company. Helix Dynamics was privately held but governed by a board of directors, and certain of its filings and corporate records were a matter of public access to anyone who knew where to look, and Leo knew exactly where to look. He cross-referenced what he found in those filings against the business plan he had photographed in the apartment, the one with Adrian's name in the chief executive's chair, and slowly, piece by careful piece, a second and far more dangerous picture came into focus. Adrian Voss had been hired 3 years earlier as vice president of business development, a respectable but limited role. But according to the company's actual operations, Meredith had been quietly, steadily transferring authority to him, handing him responsibilities and decision-making power that, by the company's own governance rules, required the approval of the board. She had been reshaping the entire leadership structure of Helix Dynamics to position her lover as her successor, grooming him to take the chief executive's seat while she moved up to president, exactly as their secret business plan described. And she had never once brought any of it before the board. The directors had no idea that the woman they trusted to run their company was romantically involved with the vice president she was rapidly elevating. They had no idea that the reorganization quietly reshaping their company had never been authorized, never been voted on, never even been disclosed. Meredith had been operating on the cool assumption that she could restructure an entire company around her personal relationship, and that no one would ever think to check. It was a breathtaking breach of the duty she owed to the people who had entrusted her with their company, and Leo, the patient, underestimated accountant, had found it sitting in plain sight, simply because he was the one man careful enough to add up the numbers. He took no pleasure in any of it. He sat at his table late into the night, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's double betrayal, the personal and the professional, and he felt no triumph, only a deep and weary sadness. He had loved this woman for 28 years. He did not want to destroy her, but he understood, with the clarity of a man who has finally stopped lying to himself, that he was no longer obligated to protect her from the consequences of what she had done. For decades he had been the steady foundation that allowed Meredith to take her risks, the quiet man who smoothed over her rough edges and cleaned up after her ambitions. He was not going to do it anymore. He gathered his photographs, his spreadsheets, his printouts, his careful timeline, and he organized them the way he organized everything, with patient precision, into a file. And then he decided it was time to talk to his wife. He chose a Saturday morning for it. Meredith was in the kitchen in the pale yellow robe he had given her 3 Christmases before, sipping coffee from her favorite mug, scrolling through her phone, the very picture of peaceful domestic contentment. Once, that scene would have filled Leo with quiet happiness. Now it felt like watching an actress in a role she had long since stopped believing in. "We need to talk," he said, and he set the folder of evidence down on the kitchen table between them. Meredith looked up, and he watched her expression travel from casual attention to sharp awareness as her eyes fell on the documents. Her coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. And for just a moment, Leo saw something cross her face that he had not expected. It was not fear. It was not shame. It looked almost like relief. "What's this about?" she asked, but her voice did not carry the confusion the question should have held. She already knew. I went to the apartment, Leo said. The one at Crestview. He sat down across from her, watching her shoulders square and her breathing settle into something deliberate and controlled. I used the key from our junk drawer. Meredith set her mug down with slow, careful precision. And when she looked at him again, the mask was simply gone. The loving wife, the tired executive, the woman who had been apologizing for late nights and kissing his cheek every morning, all of it vanished. And in her place sat someone Leo barely recognized, a woman whose eyes held a cool, businesslike calculation he had never seen turned on him before. I see, she said. How much do you know? The question struck him like a blow. Not a denial. Not an apology. Not even anger. Just a practical inquiry into the scope of his discovery, as though they were two executives assessing a problem that had arisen and needed to be managed. Everything, Leo said. The apartment. Adrian. The divorce planning. The legal strategy. The plan to make me look like an inadequate husband. All of it. Meredith nodded slowly, her fingers drumming against the table in a rhythm he recognized from her descriptions of difficult board meetings. She was calculating, recalibrating, deciding how to handle this unexpected complication in her carefully orchestrated plan. How long have you known? She asked. Since Thursday, he said. When I visited your office, and the guard told me he sees your husband every day. Something that might have been amusement flickered across her features. Poor Earl, she murmured. Always was a bit too chatty. She reached for her coffee again, unhurried. I suppose this complicates things. Complicates things, Leo repeated, and he heard his own voice rise despite himself. Meredith, we have been married for 28 years. You have been living with another man, planning to divorce me, building a false case against me for 2 years, and all you can say is that this complicates things. She sighed, a small sound of mild irritation rather than distress. Leo, let's not be dramatic. We both know this marriage has been over for years. We both know, he said. I didn't know anything. I thought we were happy. And Meredith laughed, a short, humorless sound. Happy, she said. Leo, when was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time you showed any interest in my world, my goals, anything beyond your little practice and your quiet evenings at home? I have always supported your career, he said. I have always been proud of you. You have been passive, she corrected, and her voice took on the sharp, cutting edge he imagined she used on underperforming employees. You have been content to let me carry the ambition, the social weight, the responsibility of actually building a life worth living, while you coasted along in your comfortable little routine. I have been growing, Leo. Changing. Becoming someone who needs more than you were ever willing to offer. Each word landed like a small, precisely aimed dart, finding targets in him he had not even known were exposed. If you felt that way, he said quietly, why didn't you talk to me? Why didn't you tell me what you needed? I tried, she said. God knows I tried. But every time I brought up traveling more, or expanding your practice, or moving somewhere better, you found a reason to stay exactly where you were. You were always perfectly satisfied with exactly what we had, no matter how much I outgrew it. So you decided to replace me, Leo said, instead of working with me. Meredith's expression softened, but not with anything like affection. It was the patient, slightly weary look a teacher might give a slow student. I didn't set out to replace you, she said. I met Adrian 3 years ago. He was everything you are not. Ambitious. Dynamic. Interested in building something larger than himself. First it was respect. Then it was friendship. Then it was more. And that justified 2 years of lying, Leo said. For the first time, Meredith showed a flash of genuine emotion, but it was not guilt or sorrow. It was annoyance. I wasn't lying, she said. I was protecting you from a reality you weren't ready to face. Our marriage was already over. You simply refused to see it. She rose and crossed to the window, moving with the fluid grace that had first drawn him to her almost 30 years before. I kept hoping you'd develop a passion for something, anything beyond your routine, she said, looking out at the garden they had planted together. But you never did. You're the same man at 56 that you were at 36. And I am not the same woman. Do you love him? Leo heard himself ask. Meredith turned back, and for the first time in the entire conversation, her face softened into something real, though it brought him no comfort at all. I do, she said. I love Adrian in a way I never loved you. He challenges me. He inspires me. With him I feel like I'm living instead of just existing. And with me, Leo said. She looked at him for a long moment, and her answer was neither cruel nor kind, only honest. With you I felt safe, she said. Comfortable. Unchallenged. For a long time I thought that was enough. But it isn't, Leo. I want more than safe. Leo sat in the quiet of his own kitchen and absorbed the full weight of it. 28 years of marriage, and the thing she had valued most about him in the end was his ability to make her feel secure, a thing she had come to despise as a kind of smallness. Everything he had offered as love, she had received as a limitation. So you and Adrian have been planning to get rid of me, he said. We have been planning our future, she corrected smoothly. The divorce was always going to be necessary. We simply wanted to handle it in a way that was least disruptive for everyone. Least disruptive, Leo said, and he set the legal consultation summary on the table between them. You have been building a case against me for months. Emotional abandonment. Lifestyle incompatibility. Documenting everything I do so you can use it against me. She had the grace to look faintly uncomfortable. The legal advice was to protect both of us, she said. Divorce can get ugly when people aren't prepared. Protect both of us, Leo repeated. Meredith, you have been systematically destroying my reputation with our friends, making me out to be an inadequate husband who drove his poor wife into another man's arms. I have been honest about the state of our marriage, she said, with a defensiveness that did not quite hide the steel underneath. If that makes you uncomfortable, perhaps you should ask yourself why. The circular logic of it was dizzying. And Leo recognized it then for exactly what it was, a masterful practice kind of manipulation. The ability to commit the betrayal and somehow leave the betrayed standing there questioning his own perceptions. She had been unfaithful, deceptive, and calculating for years, and yet here she stood, gently inviting him to examine his own failings. When do you want me to move out? He asked. Meredith looked almost surprised. You don't have to move out immediately, she said. We can work out the details through the lawyers. I'm not heartless, Leo. Not heartless, he thought. Just willing to spend 2 years engineering his quiet destruction. Just capable of kissing him goodnight while planning his replacement, of texting him love you from a bed she shared with another man. But not heartless. He stood up, and he felt every one of his 56 years settle onto his shoulders. I'll contact a lawyer on Monday, he said. Leo, she called as he reached the doorway. He turned. For just a moment in the soft morning light, she looked almost like the woman he had married. I really am sorry it happened this way, she said. I never wanted to hurt you. Leo studied her face, looking for any sign that she truly understood the magnitude of what she had done. There was only a mild, polite regret, the kind of sadness a person might feel about a business decision that had unfortunately inconvenienced someone else. No, he said quietly. You just wanted to replace me. The hurt was only collateral damage. And he walked up the stairs to the bedroom that no longer felt like his. And as he went he could hear Meredith already on the phone behind the kitchen door. Her voice lifting into an animation it had not held during their entire conversation. She was calling Adrian, he understood, to tell him the secret was finally out, that they could move their timeline forward, that the inconvenient husband had at last been dealt with. What she did not know, what neither of them could have imagined, was that the inconvenient husband had spent his whole quiet life learning exactly how to read a set of books that did not add up. And he had already found every single thing that did not add up in hers. Monday morning, Leo sat across a polished desk from David Reyes, a sharp, soft-spoken divorce attorney whose firm had, by a bitter irony Leo could not ignore, handled the updating of his and Meredith's wills 5 years before. Now Leo had come to that same firm to protect himself from the woman he had once made those wills with. Reyes spread the documents across his desk, the photographs of the apartment, the printouts of the divorce strategy, the carefully labeled evidence of Meredith's 2-year campaign, and he studied them in silence for a long while. Mr. Avery, he said at last, leaning back in his chair, I have to be honest with you. In 30 years of practice, this is one of the most calculated divorce strategies I have ever seen. Your wife has been building this case against you for a very long time. Leo nodded. He had known it, but it landed differently, hearing it from a professional. What are my options, he asked. Reyes leaned forward. The good news, he said, is that her entire strategy depends on you being unprepared and uninformed. It depends on you being blindsided. The fact that you discovered all of this before she ever filed changes everything. He tapped the consultation summary. She was planning to paint you as emotionally unavailable and financially irresponsible. We can dismantle that narrative completely. How, Leo asked. With facts, Reyes said simply. You have been the stable, supportive spouse for 28 years. You have never been unfaithful. You supported her career at every turn, even when it cost you. You managed your shared finances responsibly. And more than that, he added, his voice sharpening, you have documented evidence of her systematic deception and her adultery. Even in a community property state like ours, that matters. A judge will see exactly who was the faithful partner here and who was not. There's something else, Leo said, and he reached into his bag and drew out a second folder, the one he had prepared over the long weekend at his kitchen table. I've done some financial analysis. Reyes raised an eyebrow as Leo spread the spreadsheets across the desk, and this was where 30 years of accounting became a weapon rather than a quiet profession. Meredith earns $200,000 a year, Leo explained, but our joint household expenses have run about $60,000 a year above her salary for the past 3 years. I've been quietly making up the difference without ever realizing it. I was putting $80,000 of my own income into our joint account, keeping only $40,000 for myself, and telling myself I was being generous, letting her save. Reyes studied the figures, his expression growing keener by the second. And Leo continued, pointing to a series of highlighted withdrawals. She's been drawing down our joint savings to fund the apartment with Adrian. The rent. The dinners. The trips. The gifts. All of it paid for with money I earned and contributed to what I believed was our shared future. Reyes sat back, and when he spoke, his voice was flat and certain. Mr. Avery, this is fraud, he said. She has been using marital assets to fund an adulterous relationship, while secretly planning to divorce you. That is going to significantly affect how any judge views the division of property. But Leo was not finished. There's more, he said, and he drew out a third set of documents. Over the weekend, I did something I never imagined I'd do. I investigated my wife's company. Reyes's eyes narrowed with interest. Adrian Voss was hired 3 years ago as a vice president, Leo said. But according to the corporate records I've reviewed, Meredith has been systematically transferring authority to him, responsibilities and decision-making power that, under the company's own governance rules, require board approval. She's been grooming him to take over as chief executive while she moves up to president, exactly as their private business plan describes. But she has never presented any of it to the board. She's been quietly restructuring the entire leadership of the company around her romantic partner, and the directors have no idea. They don't know about the relationship, and they don't know about the reorganization she's been implementing without their authorization. Reyes was taking notes rapidly now. Mr. Avery, he said, this is no longer just about your divorce. If what you're describing is accurate, your wife is in breach of her fiduciary duty to her company's board. She could be facing very serious professional consequences. The thought gave Leo no pleasure at all. He had loved Meredith for 28 years, and he took no joy in holding the evidence that could end her career. But he had also stopped being willing to pretend he did not see it. What do you recommend, he asked. We file first, Reyes said without hesitation. We get ahead of her narrative and put the facts on the record before she can spin them. And more than that, we make sure the board of Helix Dynamics understands what has been happening right under their noses. Because once that comes out, it changes the entire balance of this divorce. That afternoon, Leo did something that went against every protective instinct he had cultivated across nearly 3 decades of marriage. For years he had been the husband who quietly smoothed over Meredith's rough edges, who covered for her occasional shortcuts, who provided the stable foundation that let her take her professional risks without ever paying the full cost of them. Now he picked up the phone and he stopped protecting her. He called Robert Keller, the chairman of the board of Helix Dynamics. Leo and Robert had met several times over the years at company functions, and Leo had always liked the man's plain, straightforward decency. "Leo," Robert said, his voice warm and unsuspecting. "What can I do for you?" "Robert," Leo said, "I need to bring something to your attention about corporate governance at Helix. It's a delicate matter, but I believe the board has a right to know about some structural changes that may not have been properly authorized." There was a pause. "What kind of structural changes?" Robert asked. Leo spent the next 20 minutes laying it out, carefully, factually, sticking entirely to the corporate questions and saying nothing at all about his marriage or the betrayal beneath it. He described the pattern of authority quietly shifted to Adrian Voss, the reorganization that had never come before the board, the gap between what was happening inside the company and what the directors had been told. Robert listened without interruption, his questions growing sharper and more pointed with each passing minute. "Leo," Robert said finally, his voice gone tight, "are you telling me Meredith has been implementing major leadership changes without board approval?" "I'm telling you," Leo said carefully, "that based on the records I've reviewed, there appears to be a significant disconnect between what's been happening operationally and what's been reported to the board." "And why?" Robert asked slowly, "are you the one bringing this to me?" Leo was quiet for a moment. "Because I believe in doing things honestly," he said. "And because the board has a right to know what's being done in its name." After he hung up, Leo sat alone in his small office and felt a strange, heavy mixture of satisfaction and sorrow. For years, he had been the man who cleaned up Meredith's messes, who smoothed her path, who made it possible for her to take risks without consequences. Now, for the first time, he was the one creating consequences she would actually have to face. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like the quiet, sober closing of a very long account. That evening, Meredith came home later than usual, and the moment she walked in, Leo could see that something had cracked in her famous composure. Her face was tight with stress, her usual cool control frayed at the edges. "We need to talk," she said, setting her briefcase down with more force than necessary. "About what?" Leo asked. "About the call Robert Keller made to me this afternoon," she said. "About the corporate governance review the board has suddenly decided to conduct." Her eyes were hard and bright. "About the fact that my own husband is apparently trying to destroy my career." Leo met her gaze steadily. "I shared factual information about a corporate reorganization that appeared to lack proper authorization," he said. "Nothing more." "Don't play innocent with me, Leo," she snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing." "Yes," he said. "I did. The same way you knew exactly what you were doing when you spent 2 years planning my replacement." Meredith's composure cracked further. "This is different and you know it," she said. "This affects my professional reputation. My ability to make a living. Your affair with Adrian affects that too," Leo said quietly. "The board was going to find out eventually that you've been restructuring the company to benefit the man you're sleeping with. I just gave them a head start." She stared at him for a long moment, and Leo could see her reassessing everything she thought she knew about him. The passive, supportive husband who had never once challenged a decision she made. That man was gone. In his place sat someone who understood the value of information, and was no longer afraid to use it. "What do you want?" she asked at last. "I want you to stop treating me like I'm stupid," Leo said. "I want you to acknowledge that your actions have consequences beyond your own happiness. And I want you to understand that I am not going to quietly disappear just because it would be convenient for your new life." Meredith sat down across from him, her posture defensive. "The board review will pass," she said. "There is nothing illegal about operational restructuring." "Maybe not illegal," Leo agreed. "But unauthorized restructuring that benefits your romantic partner, a relationship you never disclosed to the board, that is going to be much harder to explain." He watched her quick mind racing behind her eyes, calculating the political and professional cost of what was coming, and for the first time since he had discovered the betrayal, he saw genuine fear cross his wife's face. "What is it going to take?" she asked, her voice low, "to make this go away?" "It's not going away, Meredith," Leo said. "You set this in motion when you decided to live a double life." Now we all have to deal with the consequences. You're destroying everything I've worked for, she said. Leo shook his head slowly. No, he said. You destroyed it yourself. I'm just refusing to help you cover it up anymore. That night, as Meredith made tense, hushed phone calls behind the closed door of the home office, Leo lay awake and understood that something fundamental had shifted between them, something that would never shift back. For 28 years, he had been the one who adapted, who accommodated, who made space for her ambitions and her choices and her moods. Now, for the first time in their entire marriage, she was the one who would have to adapt to consequences she could not control. It was not revenge exactly. It was something quieter and in its way more powerful. It was simply the refusal to keep enabling someone who had been betraying him for years. Meredith had built her entire plan on the assumption that Leo would remain passive, predictable, and manageable, right up to the end. She was about to learn how badly she had misjudged the quiet man she thought she had figured out. The next morning, Leo Avery filed for divorce. And more importantly, he stopped being the man who made his wife's life easy at the cost of his own dignity. After 56 years of believing that love meant endless accommodation, he was finally learning that sometimes love, even love of oneself, means knowing exactly when to stop. The board of Helix Dynamics did not move quickly, but it moved thoroughly, the way careful institutions do when they suspect that something rotten has been growing quietly in their foundations. In the days after Leo's call, Robert Keller convened a small committee of independent directors and brought in an outside firm to conduct a full review of the company's governance and decision-making over the previous 3 years. They were not looking at first for an affair. They were looking for the simple, sober answer to a simple, sober question. Had the chief executive been making major structural decisions without the authorization she was required to obtain? And the more they looked, the more they found. Meredith, to her credit, did not crumble. She was a formidable woman, and she fought the review with everything she had. She produced memos and meeting notes and reorganization plans, framing the whole thing as ordinary operational management, the kind of day-to-day decision-making any chief executive was entitled to make. For a few days it almost worked. She was articulate and confident, and she had spent a decade building trust with these directors. But Leo had spent 30 years learning that the truth lives in the places where the paper trail goes quiet, and the board's investigators were good at their jobs. They found the gaps. They found the authority that had migrated to Adrian Voss with no formal vote behind it. They found the quiet rewriting of reporting lines, the responsibilities reassigned, the succession quietly engineered. And then, because these things always come out in the end, they found the relationship. It was not Leo who told them. He had been careful, from his very first call to Robert Keller, to speak only of corporate governance and never of his marriage, because he understood that the moment the matter became a jilted husband's revenge, it would lose all its weight. But the board's investigators were thorough, and a reorganization that benefits a particular vice president invites questions about why. And questions about why have a way of leading to apartments at Crestview and beach photographs and a closet full of shared clothes. When the committee finally understood that the chief executive had been secretly involved with the very man she had been grooming, without authorization, to replace her, the entire matter changed character completely. It was no longer a question of operational style. It was a profound, undisclosed conflict of interest at the very top of the company. A chief executive reshaping the future of a business she did not own to suit the man she loved, while the owners of that business were kept entirely in the dark. Adrian Voss, it turned out, had far less spine than ambition. When the review closed in on him, he did not fight, and he did not stand by Meredith. He scrambled to protect himself, and at one point, in a move that told Leo everything he needed to know about the man Meredith had thrown away her marriage for, Adrian even tried to come to Leo directly. He appeared one evening at Leo's office, the polished charcoal suit a little less crisp than it had been in that marble lobby, the confident bearing gone brittle around the edges. "Mr. Avery," he said, "we should talk man to man." Leo regarded him across the quiet office, this man who had been introduced as his wife's husband, who had slept in a bed Leo's money had paid for, and he felt, to his own surprise, almost nothing. Not hatred. Just a vast, clean distance. "I don't think we have anything to discuss," Adrian, Leo said. but I'll give you one piece of advice free of charge because you're going to need it. When all of this is finished, and it's finished soon, the only person standing beside Meredith is going to be Meredith. You should plan accordingly." Adrian's jaw tightened, and something ugly and frightened flickered behind his eyes, and then he turned and left without another word. He had come hoping to find a fellow victim, perhaps, or a man he could manage. Instead, he had found a quiet accountant who had already counted every card in the deck, and who was no longer afraid of any of them. The end, when it came in a boardroom Leo never set foot in, but which he could picture clearly all the same. The committee delivered its findings. They had not found anything criminally actionable. No embezzlement, no theft of funds, nothing that would send anyone to prison. But they had found a damning pattern of unauthorized decision-making and undisclosed conflict of interest that had badly compromised the integrity of the company's leadership, and that was more than enough. Adrian Voss was terminated immediately. His position had always depended on his professional judgment being free of personal entanglement, and his secret relationship with the chief executive represented exactly the kind of conflict that could not be tolerated. He was escorted out of the building he had once strolled through like a king, and his name was struck from the company's future as cleanly as he had once tried to write Leo out of Meredith's. Meredith herself survived, but only barely, and the survival was its own kind of punishment. The board could not easily remove a sitting chief executive without triggering chaos, but they no longer trusted her, and trust, once broken at that level, does not grow back. She was placed on formal probation. Her decision-making authority was sharply curtailed. A newly appointed chief operating officer was installed above the day-to-day operations, a sober, watchful man whose entire job, in practice, was to supervise the woman who had once answered to no one. Meredith Avery, who had built her whole identity around her power and her autonomy, who had told her husband that being with him felt like a cage, now found herself working under closer oversight than she had endured since her very first job out of school, decades before. The empire she had been quietly building, the one with Adrian in the corner office and herself at his side, the one she had been willing to torch her marriage to construct, had collapsed entirely, and she had been left standing alone in the ashes of it, watched on every side. Leo learned the details of all this not from Meredith, who by then had moved into the guest room and barely spoke to him, but from the steady current of news that always flows through a city's professional circles. And as that news spread, something else began to happen, something Leo had not anticipated and did not seek. People began to reach out to him. Mutual friends, colleagues of Meredith's, acquaintances from the social world he had always stood at the quiet edge of, started to call and to write, and many of them, to his surprise, came to apologize. For months, it turned out, Meredith had been carefully seeding her version of their marriage among these people. The story of the ambitious wife and the stagnant, withdrawn husband, the gentle narrative of two people who had simply grown apart. They had believed it because she was persuasive and because Leo was quiet, and now as the truth surfaced they were ashamed. "I had no idea," one of Meredith's longtime colleagues told him, when they crossed paths at the bank. "She made it sound like you just drifted apart, like it was mutual." Nobody knew about Adrian. Nobody knew any of it. Those conversations gave Leo something he had not realized he needed. For weeks he had been quietly questioning his own memory, wondering whether he truly had been the inadequate husband Meredith described, whether perhaps he had been as blind and withdrawn as she claimed. Learning that even her closest friends had been deceived helped him understand, at last, that her capacity for manipulation had never been aimed only at him. It had been aimed at everyone. He had not been a fool. He had simply been honest, in the presence of someone who had learned to use other people's honesty against them. There was one more conversation in those final weeks under the same roof that Leo would remember for a long time. Meredith came to him one night, the cool businesslike mask cracked and exhausted, and for a moment she was almost the woman he had married. "What is it going to take?" she asked again, more quietly than before, "to make the rest of this stop?" "The board. The divorce. All of it. I have lost almost everything, Leo. Isn't that enough for you?" And Leo looked at her, this woman he had loved for 28 years, and he answered her with a gentleness that surprised them both. "Meredith," he said, "I never wanted you to lose anything. That's the part you've never understood. I didn't do this to take from you. I did it because for the first time in my life I stopped agreeing to lie. Everything that's happened to you, you set in motion yourself long before I ever found that key in a drawer. I'm not your judge. I'm just no longer your accomplice." She had no answer for that. She had spent 2 years building a story in which Leo was the obstacle to her happiness, the dead weight she had to cut loose, and she had never once imagined that the quiet weight she was so eager to be rid of might turn out to be the one steady thing that had been holding her entire life together. Now she stood in the wreckage of everything she had reached for, and she finally understood, far too late, that the man she had thrown away had never been her cage. He had been her foundation. And a foundation, once you tear it out, takes the whole house down with it. The divorce was finalized 6 months after Leo first walked into that marble lobby with a coffee and a sandwich and walked out with the ruins of his marriage. It did not go the way Meredith had spent 2 years planning. Her entire strategy had depended on catching Leo unprepared, on a judge seeing a brilliant, ambitious woman freeing herself from a stagnant, emotionally absent husband. Instead, her own lawyer, faced with the documented evidence of her adultery, her financial deception, and her professional misconduct, sat her down and advised her, in the plainest possible terms, to abandon her original plan entirely and accept a far more equitable settlement than she had ever intended to offer. The carefully built case against Leo evaporated the moment it met the facts, the way a clever lie always does when a patient accountant lays the real numbers down beside it. In the end, Leo kept the house, the red brick home they had shared for 20 years, the one he had quietly paid the larger share of all along. Meredith kept her own retirement accounts and half of their joint savings, minus the substantial sum she had drained away to fund her secret life at Crestview. It was fair in a way that her own strategy never would have been, and the fairness itself was a kind of justice. But the truth was that the financial settlement gave Leo little satisfaction. The money had never been what mattered to him. What mattered, what he had quietly fought for, was simply the refusal to be erased, the insistence that the truth be told before the lie could harden into history. The deeper consequences unfolded slowly over those 6 months, carried to Leo on the steady current of the city's professional gossip. Adrian Voss, terminated and disgraced, had found that a man fired from the chief executive's side for a conflict of interest is not a man other companies rush to hire. He had eventually taken a position with a smaller firm out in Denver, at considerably less money and considerably less prestige than he had enjoyed at Helix Dynamics, and he had quietly left the city behind. The apartment at Crestview, the warm and lived-in second home with its shared closet and its beach photographs and Meredith's favorite throw pillows, had been given up almost overnight, the lease surrendered, the furniture sold or hauled away. And Meredith, the woman who had grown accustomed to a corner office and a luxury lifestyle subsidized in part by a husband she was planning to discard, had moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment closer to her office, a steep and humbling downgrade from everything she had told herself she deserved. But the cruelest twist of all, the one that no judge and no board had handed down, the one that Meredith had built entirely with her own hands, was this. The great love affair. The grand passion she had been willing to burn 28 years of marriage to pursue. The relationship she had insisted was the real thing while her marriage was only a cage. Lasted exactly 6 weeks after Adrian moved to Denver. 6 weeks. It turned out that what Meredith and Adrian had shared was never quite the deep, sustaining love she had imagined it to be. It had been built on the electricity of secrecy, the thrill of stolen dinners and hidden weekends, and the intoxicating fantasy of a shining new life always just over the horizon. It had been exciting precisely because it was forbidden, and precisely because it was a plan rather than a reality. And the moment the secrecy was stripped away, the moment it had to become an actual life, 2 real people sharing real mornings and real arguments and the dull, ordinary weight of ordinary days, it simply collapsed. The glittering fruit she had reached for, the one she had thrown away her steady harvest to grasp, went soft and brown and rotten in her hand within weeks, and she was left holding nothing at all. Leo, meanwhile, was slowly and carefully learning how to live. The house he had won in the settlement was his, legally and completely, but he found that he could not quite be at peace inside it. Every room held a memory that he now knew had not meant what he thought it meant. The mantel with its wedding photographs. The garden they had planted together in their second year. the coffee table they had chosen, the kitchen where she had kissed his cheek 10,000 times on her way to a life he never knew about. The house was beautiful, and it was full of ghosts, and Leo understood, after a few quiet months of rattling around inside it alone, that a man cannot begin a new life inside the carefully preserved shell of an old one. So he did something that would have frightened the Leo of a year before. He sold the house. He let it go. The brick and the garden and the ghosts and all, and he bought a smaller place across town, a modest, sunlit apartment with big windows and good light, a space that held no memories at all because it was entirely, finally, his own. It was astonishing he found how much lighter a life could become once it belonged to you. For the first time in decades, Leo lived without the constant, low undercurrent of someone else's dissatisfaction humming always in the background. He had not even realized how much of himself he had been spending year after year on the quiet labor of anticipating Meredith's moods, accommodating her ambitions, compensating for whatever restlessness in her he had been too trusting to name. His new apartment was smaller than the house, but it felt vast in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. He could read late into the evening without the creeping worry that his contentment with a good book was somehow a disappointment to someone who needed more. He could cook the simple meals he actually liked, instead of elaborate dinners meant to impress a woman who, he now understood, had probably been texting Adrian across the candlelight the whole time. He woke when he liked, walked where he liked, sat in his own quiet with his own thoughts, and slowly, like a plant turned at last toward the light, the gentle, steady man that Meredith had spent years calling boring began, in the freedom of his own small honest home, to flourish. It was in the gentle ordinariness of that new life that Leo met Rosemary. He had not been looking, and he certainly had not expected it, for he had quietly assumed that romance was a thing that belonged to the part of his life that was now over. But life, as the old gardeners know, has a way of putting up new shoots in the most unexpected season. Rosemary was a widow, a few years younger than Leo, whom he met through the small congregation at the church he had begun attending again after the divorce, drawn back to it by a need for quiet and community he had not felt in years. She helped run the church's lending library, a modest collection of well-loved books in a sunlit back room, and Leo had wandered in one Sunday looking for something to read, and the two of them had fallen into a conversation about an old novel that lasted nearly 2 hours and felt like 10 minutes. Rosemary was, in almost every way, the opposite of the woman Leo had been married to. Where Meredith had been all sharp ambition and restless hunger for more, Rosemary moved through the world with a settled, unhurried contentment that Leo found deeply, almost startlingly familiar, because it was so much like his own. She loved long conversations about books. She enjoyed quiet dinners that did not need to be productions, meals eaten slowly at a kitchen table with the windows open. She had no interest in impressing anyone, and no interest in being impressed, only in the simple, genuine pleasure of good company and honest talk. And the thing about Leo that Meredith had come to despise, his contentment with simple pleasures, his deep capacity for finding joy in the small and the steady, was the very thing that Rosemary found most charming about him. Their courtship, if a pair of people in their late 50s can be said to court, unfolded as gently and patiently as everything else in Leo's new life. They took long walks in the evenings, when the light went gold and soft. They cooked for each other, trading recipes and quiet stories of their earlier lives. They read in the same room, sometimes for an hour at a stretch, in a companionable silence that asked nothing of either of them. And one evening, sitting on Leo's small balcony as the sun went down, Rosemary reached over and took his hand, and Leo realized, with a kind of wonder that brought a sting to his eyes, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be loved by someone who was not, somewhere underneath the affection, quietly disappointed in him. With Rosemary, his steadiness was not a limitation to be endured. It was a treasure to be valued. His loyalty was not an expectation she took for granted, but a gift she received with gratitude. His honesty was not a tool to be used against him, but the very foundation she most admired. For 28 years, Leo had been trying to earn the love of a woman who had decided he was not enough. Now, in the easy warmth of an uncomplicated affection, he understood at last that the problem had never been what he had to offer. The problem had only ever been who was receiving it. And Leo found something else in that new life too. A purpose he had never gone looking for. Word had quietly spread, in the way these things do, of how the gentle accountant had untangled his own wife's deception, how the quiet man no one had ever paid much attention to had read a set of hidden books and found the truth buried in them. And slowly, people began to come to him. Not just for their taxes now, but for help of a more delicate kind. A woman came to him one afternoon, a soft-spoken woman about his own age, who sat across his desk and twisted a handkerchief in her hands and confessed that she thought her husband might be hiding money from her, moving their savings somewhere she could not see, and that she felt foolish and powerless and did not know where to begin. And Leo, who knew exactly what that particular kind of fear felt like, set down his pen and looked at her kindly and said, "You are not foolish and you are not powerless. Let me show you how to look." He helped her, the way no one had ever needed to help him because he had been able to do it himself. And when she left his office weeks later with the truth in her hands and a plan to protect herself, she wept and thanked him. And Leo felt something settle warmly in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. The quiet skill that Meredith had dismissed as his little accounting practice, the patient, unglamorous gift for reading the numbers and finding the truth, turned out to be a thing that could rescue people. He had used it to save himself. Now he used it again and again to help others who had been made to feel as small and as blind as he once had. The steady, deep-rooted vine that no one had bothered to look at twice was quietly feeding more people than anyone had ever guessed it could. It became over those years a quiet and unexpected vocation. There was the elderly man, a retired schoolteacher named Walter, who came to Leo convinced he was simply growing forgetful, because money kept vanishing from his accounts in amounts he could not explain. Leo sat with him for an afternoon and gently traced the missing money to a charming younger relative who had appointed himself the old man's helper, and who had been quietly bleeding him for 2 years. Leo did not lecture, and he did not shame. He simply laid the numbers out, clear and undeniable, the way only a patient accountant can, and he helped the old teacher understand that he was not losing his mind, only being robbed, and that there were ways to stop it. There was the young couple, drowning in a debt they did not understand, who left Leo's office hours later with a plan and, more importantly, with hope. There was the widow whose late husband's business partner was quietly cheating her out of her share, and the frightened woman whose new fiancé seemed strangely interested in her late mother's inheritance. One after another they found their way to the small warm office of the gentle man with the careful eyes, and one after another, Leo helped them find the truths that someone in their lives was working hard to keep buried. He never grew rich from this work and he never wanted to. He charged the ones who could pay a fair and modest fee, and he charged the ones who could not pay nothing at all, and he came to think of it as the truest and best use of the long, quiet life he had spent learning his trade. For decades, Meredith had called it his little accounting practice, the words always carrying a faint, affectionate condescension, as though it were a hobby she tolerated rather than a calling she respected. And Leo had half believed her. He had spent years quietly accepting that his careful, methodical, unremarkable mind was a small and unimportant thing. Now he knew with a certainty that settled deeper into him with each person he helped, that it had never been small at all. It was the very thing that had saved him from being quietly erased from his own life. And it was the very thing that, again and again, saved others from the same slow, invisible cruelty. The plainest vine in the garden, the one nobody had ever thought worth a second glance, turned out to have roots that reached down farther, and held more lives steady, than anyone had ever dreamed. Leo had simply needed to lose everything to finally discover how deep his own roots truly ran. One evening in late spring, Leo was sitting on the small balcony of his apartment, reading a book and watching the sun sink low over the city, when his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and went still. It was Meredith. It was the first time she had called him since the divorce had been finalized. He almost did not answer. They had nothing left between them, no shared accounts, no obligations, no reason at all to speak. But a quiet curiosity, perhaps the same instinct that had once made him a careful reader of people, made him pick up. "Hello, Meredith," he said. "Leo," she said, and her voice sounded tired, older somehow, the cool confidence worn thin. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "What can I do for you?" he asked. There was a long pause. "I wanted to apologize," she said at last, "for how everything happened. For the way I handled things." Leo waited, saying nothing, letting the silence do its patient work. I know you probably don't want to hear this, she went on. But I've had a lot of time to think about what I did. About the choices I made. Another pause. You didn't deserve what I put you through. No, he agreed quietly. I didn't. I convinced myself our marriage was already over, she said. That I was just being honest about reality. But the truth is, I ended it long before I ever admitted it to myself. I ended it the day I decided you weren't enough anymore, instead of trying to talk to you, instead of trying to build something better together. Leo found himself genuinely curious now. In the detached way a man is curious about a storm he has long since sailed clear of. What's brought all this on, he asked. Meredith let out a sound that might have been meant as a laugh, but held no humor in it. Losing everything I thought I wanted, she said. Adrian and I lasted exactly 6 weeks after he moved to Denver. It turns out our great love affair was more about the thrill of the secret and the excitement of planning a new life than about actually wanting to live one together, day after ordinary day. I'm sorry to hear that, Leo said, and was a little surprised to find that he partly meant it. Are you? She asked, and there was real curiosity in her voice. Leo considered the question honestly. Yes, he said. I am. I'm sorry you threw away 28 years for something that wasn't real. I'm sorry you hurt so many people chasing something that didn't actually exist. And I'm sorry you had to lose what we had to finally understand that it was worth something. There was a silence on the line. Do you ever think, Meredith asked softly, about what might have happened if I just talked to you? If I'd been honest about feeling restless instead of building all this deception? Sometimes, Leo admitted. But Meredith, the problem was never that you felt restless, or that you wanted more out of life. People change. That happens. The problem was that you chose deception and betrayal instead of an honest conversation. You chose to replace me instead of working with me. I know that now, she said. Do you? He asked gently. Because even in this apology, you're focused on the part that didn't work out for you. The affair that fizzled. The life that fell apart. You're sorry your plan failed, Meredith? I'm not sure you're sorry for the damage your plan did along the way. There was another long silence, and when she spoke again, her voice was very small. You're right, she said. Even now, I'm still making it about me. Yes, Leo said, without cruelty. You are. I hope you're happy, Leo, she said finally. I hope you found someone who appreciates what I was too selfish to value. And Leo, sitting on his balcony in the soft gold light of the dying day, thought of Rosemary, of her easy laughter and her gentle hands and the way she looked at him as though his quietness were a gift rather than a flaw. I have, he said. Her name is Rosemary. And she's everything you never managed to be. Honest. Kind. Capable of loving someone without an exit strategy folded away in a drawer. Good, Meredith said, after a moment, and to her credit, she sounded as though she meant it. You deserve that. And then she said goodbye. And the line went quiet, and Leo set down his phone and sat for a long while as the last of the sunlight faded from the sky, feeling not anger and not grief, but the deep, clean stillness of a man who has finally, completely let something go. In the quiet weeks that followed that phone call, Leo found himself reflecting often on everything that had happened, turning it over the way he might turn over a difficult problem until its shape finally became clear. And what became clear to him, more than anything else, was a single hard-won truth that the Leo of a year before could never have understood. For his entire adult life he had believed, without ever quite saying it aloud, that there was something a little lacking in him, some spark of ambition or hunger or drama that other people seemed to have and he simply did not. Meredith had certainly believed it, and she had spent years quietly teaching him to believe it too, recasting his contentment as complacency, his steadiness as stagnation, his peace as a kind of failure of imagination. He had absorbed that lesson so thoroughly that even after he discovered her betrayal, even after he held the evidence of her 2 years of calculated deception in his own hands, a part of him had still wondered whether she had been right, whether he really had been the inadequate, withdrawn husband she described. But now, with the distance of those quiet months and the gentle mirror of Rosemary's affection, Leo finally saw the truth of it. His contentment had never been a character flaw. His capacity to find deep joy in simple, ordinary things A good book, a home-cooked meal, a quiet evening, an honest day's work was not a limitation. It was a gift, and a rare one. His loyalty and his trust, the very qualities that had made him vulnerable to a woman who knew how to exploit them, were the same qualities that made him capable of the kind of real, deep, lasting intimacy that Meredith, for all her brilliance and ambition, had never once managed to build with anyone. Meredith had looked at his quiet satisfaction with their life and seen the boundaries of a small man. Rosemary looked at that very same quality and saw a man who knew how to be happy, who did not need constant novelty and external validation to feel alive, who could find the whole world in an ordinary evening. The thing itself had never changed. Only the eyes that beheld it had. And Leo understood, at last, that he had spent 28 years offering the truest part of himself to someone who had decided long ago that it was worthless, when all along there were people in the world who would have recognized it for the treasure it was. The seasons turned, as they always do, and Leo's new life deepened and settled and grew. He and Rosemary married quietly in a small ceremony with a handful of friends, on a bright morning 2 springs after the day he had walked into that marble lobby. There were no fireworks, no grand productions, none of the dramatic excitement that Meredith had always craved. There was only an old accountant and a gentle widow promising, with clear eyes and full hearts, to be honest and steady and kind to each other for whatever years they had left. And it was, Leo thought, the happiest day of his entire life, precisely because it was so quiet, so true, so entirely free of pretense. They bought a little house together, smaller than the brick house Leo had once shared with Meredith, but warmer and full of light. And behind it was a patch of yard that had gone to weeds. And the first thing Leo and Rosemary did, before they had even unpacked the boxes, was to start a garden. They planted tomatoes and herbs and, at Rosemary's gentle insistence, a sprawling vine along the back fence that put out broad green leaves and, in time, modest, pale green gourds, the humble and dependable kind that nourish a kitchen all through the cold months. Leo found a quiet, profound satisfaction in tending that garden, in the patient, unglamorous work of putting things into the soil and waiting for them to grow, asking nothing of them but that they be exactly what they were. He thought, sometimes, as he knelt in the dirt with the sun on his back, that a garden was the truest teacher a person could have, because it never once rewarded flash over substance. It rewarded only patience and steadiness, and the deep unseen work of roots. His little accounting practice carried on, and his quiet second calling carried on alongside it, the steady stream of frightened people who came to his office having heard that the gentle man with the careful eyes could help them find the truths that someone in their lives was trying to hide. He helped a great many of them over those years, and he never charged the ones who could not afford it, and he came to understand that this was, perhaps, the truest purpose his long underestimated gift had ever served. He had spent decades believing that his patient, methodical, unremarkable mind was a small thing, useful for taxes and quarterly reports and little else. Now he knew that it was the very thing that had saved him from being quietly erased, and the very thing that could save others from the same fate. The plain green vine, it turned out, had roots that reached far deeper, and fed far more people than anyone, least of all Leo himself, had ever imagined. And in the end, in the strange and unexpected peace of his new life, Leo arrived at a realization that would have astonished the heartbroken man who had once sat frozen in a marble lobby. He was grateful. Not for the pain, never for the pain, and not for the long sleepless nights of discovery, but for the freedom that the pain had finally, brutally set loose. For years, without ever knowing it, he had been slowly suffocating inside a marriage to a woman who had decided he was not enough, accepting love as a conditional gift that might be withdrawn the moment he failed to meet some standard he was never even allowed to see. He had been living all that time in a quiet, low-grade fear of disappointing someone who had, in truth, already decided to replace him. Meredith's betrayal, devastating as it had been, had shattered that cage and let him walk free. It had cost him a marriage he had believed in, but it had given him back his own life, and his own dignity, and ultimately a love that asked him to be nothing other than exactly what he was. Sometimes Leo came to understand the best thing that can ever happen to a person is the loss of something they were certain they could not live without. Sometimes freedom arrives wearing the disguise of catastrophe, and sometimes the most loving thing a person can do, for themselves and even for the one who has wronged them, is to simply quietly stop agreeing to be erased. Meredith had been right about one thing and only one thing in all of it. She had said on that terrible morning in the kitchen that they both deserved to be with someone who truly understood them. And it was true. She had deserved to be with someone who matched her hunger, her restlessness, her appetite for novelty and risk, and she had gone and found exactly that, and discovered too late that it was not at all what she had imagined it would be. And Leo had deserved to be with someone whose love did not come with conditions and expiration dates and exit strategies tucked away in a drawer. He had deserved someone who saw his steadiness as a harbor rather than a prison, his loyalty as a treasure rather than a burden, his quiet contentment as a kind of quiet wisdom. And in the fullness of time he had found her too. As Leo turned off the lights in his small, honest, light-filled home each night, with Rosemary's hand warm in his and the humble vine growing strong and steady in the garden out back, he understood, with a certainty that no betrayal could ever again shake, that for the first time in his entire life, he was exactly where he belonged. There was a morning a little more than 2 years after the day everything came apart, that Leo would always think of as the day his new life felt truly finally whole. It was early autumn, the same season in which his old life had shattered, and the vine along the back fence had grown thick and heavy over the summer, and the pale green gourds hung in clusters among the broad leaves, ready at last to be gathered. Leo went out into the cool morning with a basket on his arm, the way he had watched his own grandmother do when he was a boy, and he and Rosemary harvested the first real crop of their garden together, easing each humble gourd from the vine and laying it gently in the basket, their hands sometimes brushing, neither of them feeling any need to fill the comfortable silence with words. That evening they invited a few people over, the small handful who had become their true family in those quiet years. There was the couple from the church book group who had become their dearest friends. There was the soft-spoken woman Leo had once helped uncover the truth about her own marriage, who had rebuilt her life and now came to dinner often, bringing flowers and easy laughter. There was Rosemary's grown daughter and her family. They gathered around the table in the warm, light-filled little house, and they ate a simple meal made from the garden's plain and steady harvest, and the room was full of the kind of honest, uncomplicated warmth that Leo had spent decades believing he might never deserve. He looked around that table, at the faces of people who valued him for exactly who he was, who asked nothing of him but his presence and gave him nothing but their genuine affection, and he thought about all the elaborate, glittering dinners he had once cooked for a woman who was texting another man across the candlelight, and he understood, with a quiet completeness, just how far he had come. Late in the evening, after the others had gone, Rosemary handed him one of the gourds from the basket and asked him, with a teasing smile, why he was so fond of such a plain and humble thing. And Leo turned it over in his weathered hands, this modest green fruit that no one ever noticed at the market, and he was quiet for a long moment. Because nobody ever expects much of it, he said at last. They walk right past it, certain it has nothing to offer. And then it feeds them faithfully, all winter long, asking nothing in return. He set it gently back in the basket. I suppose, he said, with a soft and rueful smile, that I know a little something about being underestimated. And Rosemary laughed and kissed his cheek, and told him that being underestimated by the wrong people was simply how the right people eventually found you. Leo thought, as he washed the last of the dishes in the warm lamplight of his own honest kitchen, that he had never in his life heard anything truer. Of Meredith he heard only occasionally now, the way you hear distant weather. She remained at Helix Dynamics for a while longer, working under the watchful supervision that never quite lifted. The autonomy and authority she had prized above her marriage permanently diminished. Eventually, the gossip said, she left the company altogether and took a lesser position somewhere else. A smaller pond, a quieter title, a long way down from the empire she had once dreamed of building with Adrian at her side. She never remarried. The few who still spoke with her said she had grown harder and more solitary over the years, a woman who had reached for everything and ended up clutching very little, who could not quite stop telling the story of her marriage in a way that made her the misunderstood heroine of it. Even now, Leo felt no triumph when he heard these things, and no bitterness either. He felt only a distant, settled sorrow, the kind of quiet sadness a person feels looking at a fine fruit that fell from the tree too soon and rotted in the grass. A fruit that might have ripened into something sweet and lasting, if only it had been willing to stay on the branch and wait. She had held in her own 2 hands a steady and faithful love, a deep-rooted, dependable harvest that would have nourished her for the rest of her days. And she had thrown it away, reaching for a glitter that turned to rot within weeks, and she had ended up with nothing at all. That was not Leo's doing. He had only refused at long last to help her pretend otherwise. The rest she had planted with her own hands, and the harvest had simply come due. There was a quiet coda to the matter of the company too, one that Leo had not expected. Some months after the board review had run its course, Robert Keller, the chairman, asked Leo to meet him for coffee. Leo went, uncertain what the man could want, and found Robert already waiting at a corner table, looking older and more tired than he had at those long-ago company functions. "I owe you something," Robert said, once they had settled in. "I'm not entirely sure it's a thank you because what you brought to me cost a lot of good people a lot of pain, and it cost the company a year of turmoil we're only now climbing out of. But it was the truth. And the truth was something the board had a right to know, and something nobody else was willing to come and tell us." Leo turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "It gave me no pleasure," he said. "I want you to understand that. She was my wife for 28 years. I didn't go to you to hurt her. I went because I had spent my whole life cleaning up after people who cut corners, and I finally reached an age where I couldn't do it one more time, not even for her." Robert nodded slowly. "That's exactly why I wanted to see you," he said. "In 30 years of business, Leo, I have watched 100 clever, ambitious people convince themselves that the rules were for everyone else. And I have watched the quiet, careful ones, the ones nobody pays much attention to, hold entire companies together with their integrity, and never once get thanked for it. You're one of those. The employees of Helix Dynamics still have their jobs and their pensions because the company got caught before things went truly wrong, and that's because of you." He extended his hand across the table. "I just wanted to shake the hand of an honest man. It is rarer than you'd think." Robert offered him a consulting role that afternoon, a standing arrangement to advise the board on governance and oversight, and it was a generous offer, the kind of position that would have flattered most men and enriched any of them. But Leo, after a moment's thought, gently declined. "I appreciate it more than I can say," he told the chairman. "But I have a small practice that I love, and a quiet life that I've only just gotten back, and I find I'm not interested anymore in spending my days in rooms full of people maneuvering against each other. I'd rather help the ones who come to my little office because they have nowhere else to turn." Robert studied him for a long moment, and then he smiled, a real and rueful smile. "Of course you would," he said. "Of course you would." And the 2 men finished their coffee and parted as something close to friends, and Leo walked out into the afternoon sun feeling that the last loose thread of that whole sorry chapter had finally, quietly, been tied off. And there was a night, not long after, that Leo would hold on to for the rest of his life. He and Rosemary were sitting together in the soft lamplight of their little living room, and Leo, who had carried a particular small wound in silence for a very long time, finally let himself speak it aloud. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Rosemary set down her book. "For 28 years," he said slowly, "my wife told me I wasn't enough, that I was too quiet, too content, too small. And I think a part of me still wonders even now whether she was right. Whether there really is something missing in me, some spark that other men have and I just don't." He looked down at his hands. "I suppose I'm asking whether you ever look at me and see the boring man she saw." Rosemary was quiet for a moment, and then she reached over and took both of his hands in hers. "Leo," she said gently, "listen to me, because I'm only going to say this once, and then I want you to put it away somewhere safe and never doubt it again. The woman you were married to looked at the steadiest, kindest, most honest man I have ever known, and because she could not appreciate him, she decided the failure must be his. That is what small people do with things too good for them. They convince themselves the treasure is worthless, because it's easier than admitting they don't know how to hold it." She squeezed his hands. "When I look at you, I don't see a boring man. I see a harbor. I see the one steady, faithful, unshakable thing in a world that is forever chasing the next shiny distraction. I spent a good marriage with a good man who is gone now, and I know exactly what I'm looking at when I look at you, And I am not going to waste a single day of whatever time I have left pretending I don't. You were never not enough, Leo. You were always too much for someone who didn't know what she had. Leo did not trust himself to answer. He simply held her hands in the lamplight, and felt something that had been clenched tight inside his chest for nearly 30 years finally gently let go. And that, my friends, is where Leo's story comes to rest. But before I take you back to my garden, I want to leave you with the lesson living at the heart of it, because I believe it is one a great many of us need to hear. We live in a world that is forever telling us that steadiness is dull, that contentment is a kind of failure, that the quiet, faithful, dependable people are somehow less than the bright and restless ones who are always reaching for more. Meredith believed that with all her heart. She looked at a good and loyal man, a man who loved her faithfully and asked for nothing but honesty in return, and she decided that his steadiness was a cage and his contentment was a flaw, and she threw him away to chase something that glittered. And I want you to remember, on the days when someone makes you feel that way, that they are wrong. There is nothing small about being steady. There is nothing boring about being faithful. There is a deep and quiet strength in the person who knows how to find joy in an ordinary evening, who keeps their promises, who sends their roots down deep instead of always reaching for the next shiny thing on the surface. That kind of person is not a lesser harvest. They are the harvest that lasts all winter long, when the showy fruits have all gone soft and brown and been forgotten. Do not let anyone convince you that your steadiness is a weakness, or that your loyalty is a thing to be ashamed of, or that your contentment with a good and honest life makes you less than the restless ones who are never satisfied with anything. And if you are the one tempted to throw away something steady and true because it does not glitter the way you think you want, I beg you to remember Meredith, sitting alone in her small apartment, holding the rotted remains of the glittering thing she traded her whole life for. Because the soil, my friends, always keeps an honest ledger. You cannot plant betrayal and expect to harvest love. You cannot throw away the faithful, deep-rooted vine and expect the glittering bloom to feed you through the cold. We reap, every single one of us, exactly what we sow. And so very often it is the quiet, patient, underestimated ones, the ones everyone was so sure they had figured out, who turn out to have had the deepest roots and the truest strength all along. So now let me carry you back, one last time, out to my own garden, and to that basket of susu I gathered from the vine this morning, the plain green gourd still cool and damp with the dew. Do you remember what I told you at the very beginning, about the careless shopper who walks right past the humble chayote, reaching instead for the glossy apple and the golden mango, certain that the plain green thing could have nothing to offer? That was Meredith, standing in the marketplace of her own life. She had a chayote at home, a steady, faithful, deep-rooted love that would have nourished her for the rest of her days, and she looked at it, and she decided it was too plain, too quiet, too ordinary for a woman like her. And so she set it aside, and she reached for the fruit that glittered. She reached for Adrian, for the thrill of the secret and the excitement of the plan and the shine of a life she imagined would be so much more exciting than the steady one she already had. And do you remember what I told you would happen? Within 6 short weeks, the glittering fruit she had traded everything for went soft and brown and rotten in her hands, and she was left holding nothing at all, while the steady chayote she had thrown away simply went on, deep-rooted and unbroken, to nourish a whole new life, just not hers. Because that is the thing about the chayote that the careless never understand, and it is the thing about Leo that Meredith never understood until it was far too late. The chayote does not look like much on the surface. Its leaves are modest. Its fruit is plain. But beneath the soil, where no careless eye ever bothers to look, it sends down roots that are deeper and stronger than anyone would ever guess. Roots that hold fast through storms that tear the showy plants right out of the ground. Leo was exactly that. His wife looked at his quiet life and his gentle ways and his little accounting practice, and she saw a man with no depth, no strength, no roots worth speaking of. And she could not have been more wrong. Beneath that quiet surface was a mind so patient and so careful, so deeply and unshakably rooted in honesty, that when the storm finally came, it was not Leo who was torn from the ground. It was everyone who had underestimated him. The plain green vine had the deepest roots in the whole garden. It simply took a careless woman throwing it away to finally reveal how strong they truly were. So let me ask you something before you go tonight, and please do tell me your answer down in the comments because I read every single one. Do you think Leo was too harsh when he picked up that phone and told the board the truth about what his wife had done? Or do you think he simply let her gather in the harvest she had spent 2 long years so carefully planting? There is no wrong answer. I only want to know what is in your heart. And while you are down there, tell me this as well, because I think it may be the most important question of all. In your own life, who is the Chayote? Who is the steady one, the faithful one, the quiet and dependable one that everybody is so quick to overlook? The one with the modest leaves on the surface and the deep, strong roots underneath that nobody ever bothers to see. Maybe it is someone you love, someone who has been nourishing your life faithfully all along while you were busy looking at flashier things. Maybe, just maybe, it is you. If it is, then I hope tonight you will let yourself remember that there is nothing small about being steady, and nothing weak about being true, and that the deepest roots of all are so often hidden beneath the plainest leaves. Take a moment before you move on with your evening, to think of the faithful, steady people in your life, and perhaps to tell one of them, tonight, that you see them, that you have not overlooked them, that you know exactly how much they have been quietly nourishing you all this time. Do not be the careless one who only learns the worth of the chayote after they have thrown it away. And tell me too the city you are listening from tonight, because it truly does fill my heart to see how far we have traveled together. You and I, all of us gathered around these stories from every corner of the world. If this one moved you, if you have ever been the steady, overlooked one, or if you have ever been lucky enough to be loved by someone like that, then do an old gardener a kindness and leave a like, so that someone else who needs to hear it can find their way to this story too. Subscribe and stay close, because there is always another basket waiting to be filled out here, and another quiet morning among the vines. Take gentle care of yourselves and take gentle care of the steady, faithful, deep-rooted people who have been quietly nourishing your life all along. And I will see you, my friends, on the next one.
Ngon ơi, ngon, ngon nhỉ.